In March 1945, 20 men from the Afrika Korps stood inside a building in Michigan that shouldn't have existed. They were listening for a sound they knew, the roar of a Messerschmitt or the thud of artillery. Instead, they heard a low, rhythmic thunder that vibrated through the concrete floor and up through the soles of their boots. It wasn't the sound of battle. It was the sound of an industrial organism so vast and so relentless that it was about to do what 3 years of combat couldn't. It was about to break their minds. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann stood in a line with 19 other prisoners of war. He was dressed in standard-issue American denim work clothes, the fabric stiff and foreign against his skin, replacing the worn, sand-bleached uniform of the Afrika Korps he had worn when captured in Tunisia 2 years prior. Hartmann was a technical officer, a mechanical engineer before the war. He knew machines. He knew the smell of aviation fuel, the precise torque required for a cylinder head bolt, and the temperamental nature of a Messerschmitt engine in the desert heat. He was a man of science and steel, raised on a specific diet of national truths. He had been taught, since the days of his youth, that the German engineer was the apex of human capability. He had been taught that American society was a chaotic, mongrel experiment, a place of jazz records and racial mixing, capable perhaps of producing refrigerators and radios, but culturally incapable of the discipline required for modern warfare. He believed that quality always defeated quantity. He believed that the spirit of a warrior was worth 10 assembly lines. So, when the American guide, a Ford Motor Company supervisor named Robert Mitchell, gathered them at the entrance of the production floor, Hartmann prepared himself for a show. He expected a Potemkin village, a staged performance designed to demoralize gullible prisoners. He expected to see a few aircraft pushed back and forth to simulate activity. Mitchell stood before them, speaking in accented but clear German. He did not boast. He did not shout. He simply pointed to the vanishing point of the factory floor, a distance so great that the far wall was obscured by the atmospheric haze of the building itself. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, checking his wristwatch with a casual indifference that stung more than an insult, "what you are about to see is the B-24 Liberator production line. We complete one heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Hartmann heard the words, processed the translation, and immediately rejected them. It was a mathematical impossibility. He knew how long it took to build a heavy bomber. In the Reich, it was a process of weeks, sometimes months. It required teams of master craftsmen, hand-fitting aluminum panels, filing down rivets, and engaged in a constant artisanal struggle against tolerance variation. To claim a 4-engine bomber could be born in the time it took to cook a potato was not just a lie. It was an absurd lie. It was American bluster. But then the floor began to move. To understand the cataclysmic shock that was about to break Klaus Hartmann's worldview, you first have to understand the specific mechanical religion he adhered to. The Luftwaffe did not just fly planes, they flew masterpieces. A Focke-Wulf 190 was a marvel of engineering elegance, but it was built like a Swiss watch. If a bulkhead didn't fit perfectly, a craftsman with a file spent 4 hours shaving the metal until it seated with a satisfying click. This was the German way. It prioritized performance and perfection over volume. It assumed that the war would be short, and that the superior machine would always win the duel. The Americans, however, had decided to fight a different war entirely. They weren't fighting a duel. They were fighting an industrial avalanche. When the United States entered the war, the Ford Motor Company faced a terrifying engineering problem. An automobile has perhaps 15,000 parts. A B-24 Liberator bomber has 450,000 parts. It has 360,000 rivets alone. It has to operate at 30,000 feet in temperatures of 60 degrees below zero, carrying 4 tons of high explosives. You cannot just build a big car and call it a plane. The tolerances in aviation are measured in thousandths of an inch. The traditional aviation industry said it couldn't be done on an assembly line. They said you needed the human touch. They said mass production would result in planes that shook themselves apart in the sky. But Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, ignored them. In a hotel room in San Diego, years prior, he had sketched out a vision that would become Willow Run. He decided to eliminate the craftsman. In his factory, there would be no files. There would be no hand-fitting. Every single one of those 450,000 parts would be machined perfectly the first time, or it would be discarded. As Hartman and the prisoners stepped onto the observation deck, the sheer scale of Sorensen's vision hit them like a physical blow. The room was 3/4 of a mile long. It was the largest single room ever built by human hands, and it was full. Stretching into the distance was a single continuous organism of aluminum and steel. The assembly line was moving at a barely perceptible creep, exactly 100 feet per hour, but it never stopped. Hartman watched, looking for the struggle. He looked for the mechanic swearing at a bolt that wouldn't thread. He looked for the supervisor shouting at a team to hurry up. He looked for the chaos that defined his own experience in the Luftwaffe maintenance depots. He saw none of it. Instead, he saw a woman. She looked to be in her 20s, her hair tied back in a kerchief. She stood at a station where the center fuselage sections drifted past on an overhead conveyor. She held a pneumatic rivet gun. She did not look frantic. She looked bored. She stepped forward, aligned a pre-drilled panel, triggered the gun in a rhythmic staccato, Bert, 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 and stepped back. The panel was attached. It fit perfectly. She didn't check it. She didn't file it. She turned to her neighbor and said something that looked like a joke, laughing as the next fuselage drifted into her station exactly 63 minutes later. This was the first crack in Hartman's armor. He had been told that American labor was undisciplined and unskilled, and that was true in a way. These workers weren't skilled in the German sense. They hadn't spent 4 years in an apprenticeship learning the metallurgy of aluminum. They didn't need to. The genius wasn't in the worker. The genius was in the jig. Ford had built massive steel tooling fixtures, jigs, that held every piece of the plane in an iron grip. The worker couldn't put the part in wrong if they tried. The system had removed the possibility of human error. Hartman realized with a sinking feeling that he wasn't looking at a factory of workers. He was looking at a single city-sized machine where the humans were merely servo mechanisms, interchangeable components in a process that was terrifyingly robust. Mitchell, the guide, sensed their disbelief. He stopped the group at the mating station, the critical point where the massive wings were lowered onto the fuselage. This was the most difficult part of aircraft construction. In Germany, mating the wings to the body was a delicate surgery that could take days of alignment and adjustment. Here, a massive crane lowered the wing section. It hovered for a moment. 4 workers guided it down. There was a solid metallic thunk. The bolt holes lined up. All of them, instantly. A team moved in with torque wrenches, and within minutes, the structural integrity of the aircraft was complete. "Wait!" interrupted a prisoner named Stefan Koch, a former Stuka pilot holding the rank of Hauptmann, captain, who had flown in Russia. "You mean to say you do this once a shift? 1 plane a day?" Mitchell smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "No, Captain. The line never stops. We run 3 shifts. We are producing 1 aircraft every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." The prisoners fell silent. Koch looked at Hartman. They did the mental arithmetic together. 24 heavy bombers a day. That was nearly 170 a week from this single building. "This is Willow Run," Mitchell continued, his voice echoing slightly in the vastness. "But this is just 1 plant. We are building B-24s in San Diego. We are building them in Fort Worth. Douglas Aircraft is building them in Tulsa. North American is building them in Dallas. We will build over 18,000 of this specific model before the war is over." Hartman felt a wave of nausea. He thought back to the airfields in North Africa. He remembered the desperate scavenging. He remembered crawling over the wreckage of a downed Junker, burning his hands on hot metal, trying to salvage a fuel pump because there were no replacements coming from Berlin. He remembered the feeling of betrayal when headquarters told them that production was delayed due to bombing raids. He realized now that while he was sweating in the desert, trying to save 1 single plane, Ford's housewives were building a new Air Force every week before lunch. He had been fighting a war of courage. The Americans were fighting a war of arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins. As the tour progressed, the psychological dismantling of the German prisoners continued, methodical and ruthless. Mitchell led them past the engine dress-up line. Here, the massive Pratt & Whitney R-1800 radial engines arrived in crates. In the Luftwaffe, an engine change was a major operation. It required a hoist, a master mechanic, and a prayer. Here, the engines moved on a separate conveyor. They were stripped, inspected, fitted with cowlings and propellers, and hoisted onto the wing line line in a synchronized ballet. Hartman watched a young man, barely 18, secure a propeller hub. The boy was chewing gum. He moved with a casual slackness that would have earned him a reprimand in the German army. Yet his output was perfect. This observation triggered the second great revelation for Hartman. The German propaganda machine had insisted that only a society unified by a singular, fanatical will, the will of the Führer, could achieve greatness. They believed that democracy was weak because it allowed for dissent, for laziness, for individuality. Yet here was the counter-evidence, rolling past him on steel wheels. These workers were free. They could quit. They could strike. They went home to warm houses and drove their own cars. He had seen the thousands of automobiles in the parking lot outside. They were not driven by terror or fanaticism. They were driven by wages and a sense of a job to be done. The paradox was blinding. The weak democratic system was outproducing the strong authoritarian system by a factor of 10 to 1. The chaos of freedom was, somehow, more efficient than the order of tyranny. Mitchell led them to the end of the line. Massive hangared doors stood open, framing the gray Michigan sky. A finished B-24, gleaming in its olive-drab paint, sat ready. A tow tractor hooked onto the nose gear. "Watch the clock," Mitchell said softly. The prisoners stared at the large clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. A whistle blew. The tractor lurched forward, pulling the bomber out into the daylight. Behind it, the next bomber in line was already occupying the final station. 61 minutes, Mitchell noted. "We are running a bit ahead of schedule today." He turned to face the prisoners. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and new rubber. "Gentlemen, that plane is going to the flight line. A test pilot will fly it for 30 minutes. If it passes, and 98% of them do, it will be flown to a modification center and then ferried to England or Italy. In 2 weeks, that machine will be dropping bombs on your homeland." It was a brutal statement, delivered without malice. It was simply a fact. One of the prisoners, a die-hard SS officer named Schmidt, broke the silence. "This is a trick," he hissed, his face red. "You saved up these planes. You are rolling them out to scare us. No one can build machines this complex this fast. It is a theatrical production." Mitchell didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He simply handed Schmidt a folder. Inside were not propaganda leaflets, but dry, bureaucratic government reports. They were production statistics, steel output, aluminum tonnage, railcar loadings. "You can choose to believe it is a trick," Mitchell said. "But ask yourself, why are the skies over Berlin black with bombers? Why do your supplies never arrive? Why are you here, in Michigan, eating 3 meals a day, while your comrades are freezing on the Eastern Front without ammunition?" Schmidt threw the folder down, but Hartman picked it up. He looked at the numbers. Total German aircraft production for the entire war, roughly 119,000, mostly single-engine fighters. Total American aircraft production, over 295,000, including massive fleets of 4-engine heavy bombers. The disparity wasn't just in the number of holes, it was in the tonnage. A B-24 was 10 times the industrial effort of a Messerschmitt fighter. The Americans weren't just outproducing Germany, they were outproducing Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, while simultaneously supplying Britain and Russia. Hartman realized that the war had ended years ago. It had ended the moment the first shovel broke ground at Willow Run. The fighting since then, the dying, the suffering, the destruction of his squad in Tunisia, had just been the time it took for the math to play out. The bus ride back to the POW camp was silent. The landscape of rural Michigan rolled by. Fat cows grazing in fields, tractors working the earth. Small towns untouched by bombs. There were no craters, no air raid sirens, just an endless, terrifying normalcy. Back in the barracks, the group fractured. Schmidt and the hardliners retreated to a corner, spinning conspiracy theories. They claimed the factory was a movie set, that the workers were actors. They clung to the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons that Hitler promised were coming. Jet fighters, V-2 rockets, magic that would overturn reality. But Hartman sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Stefan Koch, the Stuka pilot, sat beside him. "We never had a chance." Coke whispered. It was an admission that felt like treason, but tasted like truth. I used to fly over Russia, Coke continued. I destroyed bridges. I destroyed trains. I thought I was winning. But for every train I destroyed, they built 2 more. For every tank I blew up, a factory in the Urals rolled out 5. We were killing them by the thousands, and they were replacing themselves by the millions. Hartman nodded. In North Africa, he said quietly, we had a rule. If a part broke, you fixed it. If you couldn't fix it, you stole it from a wreck. If there were no wrecks, the plane didn't fly. We treated every machine like it was the last one on Earth. He looked at Coke. The Americans treat planes like bullets. They fire them at the enemy, and they don't care if they get them back, because the factory has already made the replacement. The tragedy of the situation began to settle on them. It wasn't just that they had lost. It was that they had been lied to so completely by their own leaders. The Nazi leadership knew these numbers. They had to know. Yet they had sent millions of men into the meat grinder, feeding them fantasies of racial superiority to mask the reality of industrial inferiority. What do we do? A young corporal named Friedrich asked, leaning in from the bunk above. When we go home, what do we tell them? We tell them the truth, Hartman said, his voice hardening. We tell them that we didn't lose because we were betrayed. We didn't lose because of some stab in the back. We lost because we started a war with a country that can build a bomber every hour. This was the ultimate purpose of the tour. The American War Department didn't spend the money to bus prisoners around just to brag. They were planting seeds. They knew these men would eventually go back to Germany. They wanted them to return not as defeated fanatics seething for revenge, but as realists who understood the futility of fascism. Months later, the war in Europe ended. The news came over the camp radio. Unconditional surrender. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left the continent in ashes. Hartman didn't cry. He felt a strange, hollow relief. The dying was over. The math had finally reached its conclusion, but his education wasn't finished. In late 1946, Hartman was repatriated. He took a ship across the Atlantic, reversing the journey he had made as a captive. He boarded a train in France and crossed into Germany. He was heading home to Hamburg. He knew, intellectually, that the city had been bombed. He had read the reports, but reading about bombing and seeing it are different things. As he walked through the streets of his childhood, Hartman found nothing but rubble. The city was gone. It wasn't just damaged, it was erased. Miles of brick skeletons clawed at the sky. The smell of wet ash and old death hung over everything. He found his apartment building, miraculously standing amidst the ruin. He found his wife. She was gaunt, aged 10 years in the 4 he had been away. His children looked at him like a stranger. They were alive, but they were survivors of an apocalypse. That night, lying in his cold apartment, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the masonry, the loops of the story finally closed for Klaus Hartman. He closed his eyes and saw the assembly line at Willow Run. He saw the bright fluorescent lights. He saw the woman with the rivet gun. He saw the B-24 rolling out into the sunlight, and then he opened his eyes and saw the ceiling of his ruined bedroom in Hamburg. The connection was direct. The line at Willow Run was the bow. Hamburg was the target. The efficiency he had admired in Michigan was the same force that had pulverized his home. It wasn't 2 different stories. It was one continuous chain of cause and effect. The context was the German arrogance, the belief that they could conquer the world with willpower. The reveal was the pile of rubble outside his window. Hartman realized then that the Americans hadn't just defeated the German army. They had defeated the German idea. They had proven that a free people working in a chaotic, noisy, democratic system could mobilize a power that totalitarianism could not touch. In the years that followed, Hartman helped rebuild Hamburg. He worked in construction. He saw the Marshall Plan pour money into the country, helping to rebuild the very factories the bombers had destroyed. He saw Germany rise again, not as a military power, but as an economic one, embracing the very principles of industry and democracy that he had seen at Willow Run. Decades later, in the 1980s, an elderly Klaus Hartman sat for an interview with a historian studying the POW experience. "Did you hate the Americans for what they did?" the historian asked. "For the bombing? For the destruction?" Hartman thought for a long time. His hands were calloused from a life of work, but his mind went back to that day in 1945, standing on the observation deck, watching the future roll off the line. "No," Hartman said softly. I did not hate them. I was grateful to them. The historian was surprised. Grateful? Yes, Hartman said. They taught us the hardest lesson. They showed us that we were wrong. Not just strategically wrong, but morally wrong. They showed us that you cannot build a great nation on lies and slavery. You can only build it on truth and production. He paused, looking out the window at a prosperous, peaceful street in modern Hamburg. That factory, that terrible, wonderful factory, it saved us. It destroyed the Nazis so that Germany could live. The story of Willow Run is often told as a triumph of American logistics, and it was. But its true legacy lies in the silence of men like Klaus Hartmann, men who walked into that building believing in the myth of the Superman, and walked out believing in the power of the assembly line. They learned that in the 20th century, the side with the best machine tools, the best logistics, and the freest people doesn't just win the war. They determine the future. The B-24 Liberator is gone now. Willow Run has been converted, repurposed, and partially demolished. The noise of the line has faded, but the lesson remains, etched into the history of the world. Freedom is not just a moral preference. It is, when mobilized, the most efficient engine of production mankind has ever devised. One bomber every 63 minutes. The math never lies.